I haven't done one of these in a long time, so I think it's time we go back to it. Answering questions. So usually I skip the positive messages because, of course, this is responding, but I think that takes away the incentive to send good messages. And so it's not sending a good message by me ignoring them. So I will just read every single message and I'm going to go from new to old rather than what I usually do, which is go from old to new. So here it goes. From Mr. Nancy 114, very informative. This deserving of sharing. Thank you very much. Okay, so what this is about is the video I made about the Malinda people. So those flute players and horns. And thank you very much. So the next question is, people get onto Africa for not having too many paintings and drawings and such, but it's only quite recently that those have been considered the highest form of visual art, to the point of being a synonym for art. From Egypt to Rome, the highest ideal for art were tactile things you could interact with three dimensionally, like engravings, carvings, and sculptures. Even into the Renaissance, Michelangelo considered the Sistine Chapel a waste of his talent and time. Bro wanted to do sculptures which were considered more prestigious. Okay, so there's a lot in that, and I agree with almost all of it. So if you look at that, people get into onto Africa for not having too many paintings and drawings and such. Now, I'm glad you said for not having too many paintings, because they certainly do have some paintings. And even though these are carvings, they prove that there must have been some kind of culture for canvas painting in Sierra Leone. Now, of course, this canvas culture was probably not taken as seriously in Europe and probably was abandoned by the locals for this type of artwork, which was much more preferred by the Europeans. So the next part is, but it's only quite recently that those have been considered the highest form of visual art, to the point of being a synonym for art. Okay, so not only are you correct about that, but a lot of cultures, even though they could do better, didn't. Take, for example, these two images. So we can see that the golden mask is taken more seriously in terms of development. It is, you probably cannot get better than this in terms of development. But if you look at the painting, it's 2D. It's really easy to replicate for anyone today. Even some of the paintings about it are not too deep. Take, for example, the feet. They're both pointed in the same direction. It almost looks like they have the same exact leg, not a left or a right one. So, of course, painting in these era in this time was taken as a cultural thing, but it wasn't quote unquote raised to like an art thing that is better than anything else. Now, having said that, the ancient Egyptians were perfectly capable of creating some masterful pieces. While this is not Renaissance art, as we would say today, it still is a little different and uses techniques that did not exist in the other traditional version. And this was simply a choice. These art styles did not need to be developed, they already existed. So if you can see there, you have foreshortening. In other words, everything is not in 2D. Some things are to mimic 3D, like the flute player woman. Her hands are clearly showing perspective. Then, of course, you have overlapping of the bodies. You usually don't see that in ancient Egypt. A lot of overlapping of the bodies while keeping the same exact color. They keep a lot of the border colors, which are usually removed in ancient Egypt. And as you can see, some very technical stuff. Now, if we go look at the animals, you can see extreme talent being displayed here. So, for example, you can see that this cat has the overlapping, the bird has the 3D shape, the colors are vibrant. This does not look like something that comes from ancient Egypt. In fact, it looks a little modern in its way, like it's part of a kid's book today, but it is not. It is part of the ancient Egyptian painting system. And I want to show that they still paint the humans relatively easily, while the cat has all these colors. Now, remember, there's a lot here going on. Some of the coloring you have to leave spaces. This is something that they didn't do in other paintings in ancient Egypt. This is so much harder than the previous one. And in fact, in creating the Fayum mummy paintings, images like these were put into consideration. And so they took the styles of the Romans and the artistic and creativity and the colors of Egypt, put them together, and created pre-Renaissance portraiture that was perfect. Really, it could belong in any time. I mean, if we go back to this cat, you can see that it is above the usual ancient Egyptian thing. So I want to back up your point here where you say it just wasn't considered the top. And of course, why would they? Why, if you have sculptures, why would you consider some flat thing better? To make the point even deeper, you can see here that there is a lion painted in the regular style. So that cat was definitely done in a style that was beyond the normal. So let me make this point though, while I move on to your next part of your question. I'm not saying that I prefer Renaissance art over this one. In fact, there's something very religious about the simplicity of ancient Egyptian paintings. One of the things that kind of annoyed me is that until the modern world, until now in 2025, there wasn't any attempt to animate in the same style that the ancient Egyptians painted. They always have to bring it to a higher level or whatever you want to call it, even though there's so much there to be plucked. Although I did see one documentary do it. That's why I said 2025. So the next part of your question is, from Egypt to Rome, the highest ideal for art were tactile things you could interact with three-dimensionally, like engravings. Now, I want to again come back to that point because I think it's a very important one. So, if we take Greco Roman art, right, we can see here that the types of paintings that you would see later in the Renaissance had already existed in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And these fire mummy paintings prove that. But even to our eyes, the one that counted as higher art are the statues. And the reason is because it's easy to portray fabric in 2D, even though, let's say, this one is not the highest you could do. I think I could mimic some parts of this. I'm not as good as the person who painted this. And considering that this person painted this 2,000 years ago, that's pretty impressive. But the statue creating, think about it, that's marble, and this person created fabric with it. It looks like you could grab the fabric and move it. So there is something very impressive there. Now, of course, the statue version that was is highly seen even today. When we think of Roman or Greek art, the first thing that comes into our head are these statues. And I remember having large arguments with people, but when they were like, this is the beginning of the Western world, the Western art. And I said, Western art is African art. And they didn't believe me. And then I had to show them the ancient Egyptian predecessor to that little statue over there. And then they were like, oh, we get it now. And some of the ancient Egyptian statues are much better in their make than those ones. But let's move on to the next question. From Egypt to Rome, the highest ideal for art were tactile things you could interact with in three-dimensional, like engravings, carvings, and sculptures. Even into the Renaissance, Michelangelo considered the Sistine Chapel a waste of his talents and time. So let's first talk about Leonardo da Vinci before we go to him, even though they were rivals. So the thing about it is, Leonardo da Vinci considered himself an engineer, not an artist. Art just happened to be something that he was interested in at the time. And as you can see with this, some of these things are way more fascinating than I'll be honest, the Mona Lisa to me is very boring. There's nothing special about it at all. And knowing that a lot of the quote unquote art styles that were developed by Leonardo can be seen in the fine mummy paintings makes it that less impressive. But like you said, some of the practical things were much more serious in that day, which is why they wanted to do this. In fact, we know that Leonardo da Vinci stalled a lot of the time, even for the people who were paying. I mean, that's not new. We all know a whole bunch of people on YouTube who, even when they received payment, they stall on their projects. But he was stalling because he had more important things to do, like science and things like that. Now, I'm not, and you shouldn't either, looking at these people like they're morally superior characters, because at this time, and there's a documentary about it on Google, at this time these people were abusing black bodies, which they called Moors at the time. Some of the experiments that were done on the human body by this person was of Moors, so they would do experiments on dead prisoners, animals, and Moors, dead Moors, which was not cool. Think about the fact that a dead Moor would be put under the same category as an animal or a prisoner, shown that level of respect when it came to these people. So also you said Michelangelo considered Sistine Chapel a waste of his talent and time. Bro wanted to do sculptures which were considered more prestigious, which I remember that. I think he said that in writing, that he didn't enjoy his job. I can't help but speculate that the reason why some of these things mattered more to these people than those paintings, which were only later taken more seriously, is that they came out of the Islamic Golden Age. And in the Islamic Golden Age, painting of the body was really not taken seriously. 2D was nonsense. Like painting on canvases and stuff like that, that was nonsense. And of course, statues and stuff like that were taken very seriously. Symbolic things were taken seriously. Numbers, math, all of that was taken seriously. And to some degree, because they didn't push art that high, or that type of art that high, they were, the artists had to do a workaround, and that made them come up with some of the greatest art in history. I'm almost certain that there's no way Leonardo da Vinci would have come up with any of these without the groundwork that the Islamic scholars came up with. The next question, which is related to my video that I made about home team history being reacted to by that other dude, says, a lot of these storytellers were trained in mnemonically, and there were guilds and schools for these people to learn to memorize, store, and tell the history. Wild that people nowadays think they just went around doing Chinese whispers. These people put a great importance on memorization, which is part of the reason so many were reluctant on taking on writing. Even the Greeks had this point of view that writing was inferior to oral tradition, because it was essentially a reminder instead of a memorization. This is not to absolve some ancestors of their ignorance, of their hesitancy to adopt writing, but people willfully ignore that written history also has pitfalls that it not only shares with oral history, but some unique to the discipline as well. The two, as well as other mnemonic devices like the Lukasa board and Cyclone, need to be studied, taught, respected, and always taken with a grain of salt. So I'll tell you why I actually like what he is saying over here. One, I think I did kind of underplay this type of thing, so I'm glad there was that type of call out. This is what I'm kind of looking for. I want you guys to point out some of the flaws and some of the things that I'm saying. And yes, the historians, oral tradition, griots, whatever they are in Africa are not simply just talking to each other and remembering it. There are schools, there are repetitions, and I will say, even though it is oral tradition, there is a form of writing. And when we line it up together, a lot of it matches. So it's not like the oral tradition has been proven to be nonsense. We know that it has been proven to work. And I'll tell you why. So let us take a few simple things, right? So language changes over a long period of time. But if we take Bantu languages, for example, and we compare some of their early stages all the way till now, we can see that a lot of the things have not changed. I've shown you that in the Kingdom of Congo, they used to call a mouse mpuku, and they still call it that today. How does that happen? Well, songs. Even though a lot of things can be lost in pure speech because of boredom. So if I sit here and I say, take the oxygen, mix it with this, take this, move it to a spatula, pour it into a bowl. Like, you've already forgotten, you don't care. But in music form, I mean, all of us can complete this ring ring of roses, a pocket full of posies. We can all complete that because it's a song. And this is one of the methods that oral traditions did. And you compare the song from when it was created and you compare the song till now, and I've done this before, and it'll be the exact same. I've in a book, a Zulu book written, there's a lullaby that was written by Zulu people a long time ago, and this is the 1700s, and this writing still is the same as a lullaby that I heard as a kid in South Africa hundreds of years later with not a change, not even a word. Now, also remember there was that thing that I showed you where there were the actors of the Shaka Zulu movie, where the way that the Europeans, or well, white South Africans who worked in aid with the black South Africans fighting against the apartheid government to create the Zulu movie, the Shaka Zulu movie, the way they did it was to ignore all South African propaganda, look at European sources, and look at African sources. And the Africans, when they compared what the Europeans were saying, they couldn't believe how close the information was to one another because the Africans had not written it down yet.
The way he's been portrayed as the greatest man. And I don't want to talk about what I read in school, but what I've been told by my parents. You know, at home, mom and dad, all they were telling us about was Shaka, Nandi, all those people who are involved in the royal family, how great they are, how important they were. And when I got involved in the ministers, I took the part with pride. And when I looked at the script, I had to look at it and think of what my parents told me, what they used to tell me about the whole thing. And then when I saw it's right, it matches, you know, I didn't even think of the books at school. You know, and to me, I mean, he was portrayed as the greatest man that ever lived.
So, to your point, yes, there can be all kinds of things that are missed by looking at it as if it's just people talking, whereas it was a way of storing information in a correct way. And like I said, it's not just we think that it can be correct sometimes. We've seen comparisons, we've seen information from West Africa that was long gone, names of kings that were long gone. And then only when scripts from the Ajami got translated did we go, oh, that's the name that is there. And that's happened also with ancient Egyptian. Remember, the ancient Egyptians did not fully disappear as the Nubians or the Sudanic people kept the culture up until very late. And even they kept it in their culture, even though they had writing, some of them kept it in their culture in the form of oral history, which was very typical in ancient Egypt as well, because most people in ancient Egypt couldn't write. Again, I'll put a little asterisk there because I don't think they were as illiterate as people pretend they are today. So if we look into what you're saying, you said, so it's not like Chinese whispers. Then you said, these people put a great importance on memorization. This is true, which is part of the reason so many were reluctant on taking on writing. Again, I like the way you write because it leaves space for it. So there are griots that actually wrote. So, yes, I agree with you that a lot of them were very reluctant to take on writing because they had a system that already worked. Even the Greeks had this point of view that writing was inferior to oral tradition. I've heard that before, but I'm not fully sure. I've heard the people say, now keep in mind, this is just say, I heard that there was a philosopher or someone who said that if writing continues or grows, then human beings will lose their memory or not use their brain as much, which is kind of true, to be honest, because it was essentially a reminder instead of memorization. So I'll say it was memorization and a reminder. So I agree with that point. This is not to absolve some ancestors of their ignorance, of their hesitancy to adopt writing, but people willfully ignore that written history also has its pitfalls that it not only shares with oral history, but some unique to the discipline as well. So, yes, I agree with the first part, especially where he said it does not absolve them not picking up writing. But you must remember that West Africans picked up writing a lot. There was even, remember, Alfred Dapper said there was even an entire town where every single person within that town could read or write. So let us not live in this world where writing was not picked up by the traditionalists. It was. Their jobs transformed dramatically when that happened, of course, because now when you don't have to sit down and revise all day, you have free time to do other things. And that's what happened with these people. A lot of them dedicated themselves to something else. So, of course, what you said is written history has different pitfalls than oral history. One, I think written history has the problem that people think that it's true when it's written down. Two, a lot of the times with oral history, it's something that someone experienced and doesn't have the time to play with the truth. And I think written history, it's easy for someone to write something, rub it out, and rewrite it and rub it, and then publish it like months later, and then we think that that's exactly what happened when it's a revised version of what actually happened. Two, you can't write as fast as you can think for most people. But of course, we live in a world where both of these have been eclipsed by video recording, sound recording, which of course some of the people who were the descendants of the people who were in West Africa contributed heavily to some of those. And we could talk about that some other time. The two, as well as other mnemonic devices like the Lukasa board and the Cyclone, need to be studied, taught, respected, and always taken with a grain of salt. So the next one is from the same person, and he says, "This video is perfect for showing the public's view on Afrocentrism. I remember watching it and thinking, wow, they think is at the boundary of respectability, acceptable levels of Afrocentricity. He's very careful not to step on too many toes of his non black viewership. From my POV, the only one more care is from nothing." So let me first address this. Let me not go through it and then come back. Let me just address it. So this video is perfect for showing the public's view on Afrocentrism. So the public has many views of Afrocentrism, and unfortunately, most of them are not positive. This is partly due to propaganda, and partly due to, of course, some Afrocentrists who are way too far away. They can't even be accepted by their own. I mean, I could show you Afrocentrists duking it out, fighting. The tear down the middle, of course, is the so there's three types of Afrocentrists that I've seen fight for years. One being the ones that don't accept the further stuff, so the Japan, all of that. The second are the ones who they separate from Egypt. They go, we don't care about Egypt or any of that stuff. We don't even consider it part of the real Afrocentric. And then you have the third, who they think that Afrocentric means black and it includes everyone across the world. Now, there is no real reason to fight. These groups are made to fight for no reason. They need to come together and figure out where they agree. But that's harder to do. People's egos getting wrapped up and stuff like that. Now, you may think, wait a minute, I've never seen them fight. I promise you they fight. In the mainstream, they fight. The type of viewership that I've seen and the type of other characters that I've seen that work together, a lot of those, that's rare. And of course, as the word Afrocentrist started being connected with these furthest versions of it, a lot of them move towards like Pan Africanist or words like that. And that word now is taken as a political term, but it's taken more seriously than Afrocentric. And I promise you that. So, to address the two people that you talked about, and I will start by saying this, I have no hate for any of these creators. I think that it's just their opinion and they're entitled to it. And I don't think they're less intelligent or anything like that. I think they have their own perfect opinion and they can stick to it or they can change. That's up to them. So you said they think is at the boundary of respectability, acceptable levels of Afrocentricity. He very careful not to step on the too many toes of his non-black viewership. From my POV, the only one more care is from nothing. So yes, he does, and both of them do. And I would even argue that everyone I've seen in the Afrocentric circles has some level of care about mainstream attention. There are some who don't care at all, but those people will never be taken seriously by anybody. Because, of course, if you believe that everything you're saying is perfect and there is no debate there, then who wants to debate that? But let's look at these two. So, from my point of view, From Nothing just tells African stories and all of that. I think the part where he ventures away is where he starts to say that Egyptians were not black and blah blah blah. I think that's really where he goes far away. But I think all of the other stuff when he's talking about Africa, I don't think he's really that controversial. I haven't seen too many people who complain about that. Now, the other he you're talking about is Home Team History. Home Team History, as I explained, I don't watch a lot of his videos, but the ones I've watched are pretty good. I agree with you that he's in the mainstream, but I don't put that as he is not trying to step on the toes of non-black people. I think he was just trying to make a channel that follows mainstream lines, which is perfectly respectable to some degree, going on mainstream lines and pushing back and forth. And I promise you, to you, it may seem like he's not stepping on those lines, but go and look at the comments, go and look at other people reacting to his videos, and you will actually realize that he is considered very far by some, maybe not mainstream scholars, but mainstream creators. Again, I didn't make that video just to go. I don't like drama, so I was not doing it to downplay his channel. I think his channel is pretty good. But again, some points I obviously disagree with from nothing. Everybody, even King's Monologue, everybody, I disagree with them in some way. So if people are looking for pure agreement and that's it, that will never happen. Now, I don't like bringing up names of people because when you bring up names of people, people start to think that you're trying to mess with them. And I'm not one of those people who try to mess with people. But if you bring me up and I bring you up and we disagree, that's just what it is. So the next part is, and I think that's part of why they were allowed to get so big. So I don't think they were allowed to get big. I think they just got big. I'm not that conspiratorial to think that they were allowed. I think they got big because most of the audience is going to accept that. Believe me, From Nothing and Home Team History are pretty big, but I've seen bigger channels that speak about African history, and I disagree with those channels way more than these two. But I don't want to bring them up because I don't want to get into some drama. I think a lot of people actually don't even challenge those channels because they say they're too deep in Afrocentrism. But I have to say this: there are huge. You can look them up. There are huge channels that speak about Africa. As much as I'd like you to grow, I know people like the reviewer and especially his audience, the history YouTube audience, is honestly filled with closet white supremacists and Eurocentrists at best. I actually can't disagree with you at this. Targeting nobody's audience at all. A lot of the audience on YouTube that studies history, it's for nefarious reasons, and they're out there trying to toe a specific line. They're trying to get a specific line down, and anyone who goes away from it, they try to push away from it. And I've seen pushback that is unbelievable to the Afrocentrist point of view. But I mean, I'm not mentioning any channels. I've seen channels that go too deep on Afrocentrism, but all the huge channels of white supremacy they do not touch. And you guys have seen that old man that I tried to take away his point of view, which you're probably thinking, why do I keep responding to some old man? That guy gets about 40,000 views per video. So he's not just some random old dude. So then you go on to say Eurocentrists at best would deem you too radical, even though I'd say you're quite moderate on the Afrocentric scale. I don't know if they would deem me radical. I think the only part that they would say I'm radical about is my belief in ancient Egypt and the Moors and some parts. I would say that it's controversial, maybe, but I wouldn't say it's something they would never argue with. So yes, I would be a moderate on the Afrocentric scale, even though I don't know what the scale would be on a scale of From Nothing to King's Monologue. I would say King's Monologue is pretty Afrocentric, but I wouldn't put him as like the highest version. I've seen people make claims beyond anything I've seen in King's Monologue's channel. And I'm not saying King's Monologue is wrong about anything. I haven't seen too many things that I disagree with that he says. And I respect the fact that he sits down and, unlike some of the other Afrocentrists I've seen, he actually dissects information. You know, some people, they just make claims and then they pick like one phrase and they go, see, this one guy agrees with me. Whereas King's Monologue sits down with pieces of paper and all of that and dissects. And for as big as he is, that's actually kind of respectable. Now, I'm not saying I agree with everything he says, but for the most part, I see him just having a respectable opinion given the evidence. That absolutely despise him, I just know. So yeah, I think a lot of those guys would despise King Monologue. You're smack bang in the middle, but this just speaks to the average person's sensibilities in what's acceptable range to fall outside the norm of viewing history and anthropology before it gets too woke or radical. Yeah, both of those words are, yeah, I don't like both of those words because I think woke is now being used to as a political tool to try and shut people up who can see a problem. And I think it's actually working the other way around because I actually saw, I think it was on the Breakfast Club, they were saying that you shouldn't get angry at that ad because you're woke if you're angry. But you know that they would have gotten angry at that ad years ago. But now, because Donald Trump won, a lot of the quote unquote left people are trying to go away from seeing the truth because seeing the truth is costing votes. And I think you should just say the truth, whether it costs you votes or not. And of course, or radical, I'm assuming you mean the other side where people just pretend that everything was created by white people. In your other comment, you said home team has gotten soft. I guess he got tired of North Africans cursing him out in the comment sections. He even took down his original videos about the Moors, which explicitly stated their blackness, and started to upload incredibly vague videos on those topics. I mean, I'll be honest, that's just his opinion, right? Like, if he doesn't believe it anymore, he can change his mind. I'll say it again. I don't think he's being controlled. He seems very independent when I look at him. I've watched one of his lives, one of the live streams that he did, and he didn't seem like he's being controlled. I think to some degree, obviously he cares about the mainstream appeal, and I don't see why you shouldn't. I'll be honest. I'm not one of these guys who thinks that you should always stay in a corner and have the whole world think you're crazy. That is not going to work. Even the original Afrocentrist didn't believe that. That's why they took their work to real places. The next comment is, in Igbo tradition, you're also not allowed to kill pythons. And I think it has something to do with them being ancestors too. Well, I know this is true in Madagascar and a lot of African places, so it's highly possible. I don't know if it's exactly 100% true. It's highly possible that that is a thing there as well. So the next question is, okay, I'm kidding. This is going to be in part 2. This video is long enough. Thank you very much for watching. We will engage with these questions. This is from the next video about Afrocentrism, which, by the way, there's like hundreds of people talking about Afrocentrism on YouTube at all times. And I promise you, they don't have good things to say. If you would like me to react to some of these videos, because some of them are quite old, like, share, subscribe. If we can get to about 50 likes, then yeah, I will react to the next Afrocentric person who apparently debunks or shows that Afrocentrists are evil.